Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Maureen Olevnik, Coordinator of Global Food Systems. World Food Safety Day is June 7th, 2021. This is a day to reflect on the importance of safe and sustainable food, heed the work being done at K-State and around the world on advancing an understanding of cause and control of food safety issues, and look toward better nutrition through safe food worldwide. Today, we are excited to share with you a panel of food safety experts that work with interdisciplinary teams in the Food Science Institute here at K-State. Food safety is a major area of research in the Food Science Institute, including animal and plant-based foods. Through outreach to colleagues here at K-State, nationally and internationally, the Food Science Institute's research team has tackled some of the most challenging food safety problems, from testing in our Biosecurity Research Institute biocontainment BSL-3 facilities, to helping teach consumers in developing regions of the world the basics of handling and preparing safe food. We welcome back co-host Dr. Jim Stack, Professor of Plant Pathology, and welcome to our panel of experts, Drs. Sara Gragg, Randall Phebus, Carla Schwan, and Jessie Vipham.
World Food Safety Day is a great time to focus on the work being done at K-State in the area of food safety through the Food Science Institute. We're going to take a bit of a different tact on this podcast by welcoming a panel of scientists that have made food safety their professional passion. They will share with us a vision of food safety research carried out at K-State and explain how K-State is participating in the recognition of this notable day. I'd like to welcome back to the podcast Drs. Jessie Vipham, Randall Phebus, and Sara Gragg. And first time welcome to Dr. Carla Schwan. Give us a little background on what the 2021 World Food Safety Day is and where K-State fits into that.
Yeah, this is a really exciting endeavor that is led out of the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And it was actually envisioned and put into play back in 2018. So we haven't, I don't think, as a university here at K-State, participated in the past, but we saw this. The date is June the 7th. It's always every year, June the 7th. And the FAO has asked people to participate, and they've given some guidelines on things that we could do and to highlight some of the food safety work that we're doing here at K-State, which is pretty extensive. The aim of World Food Safety Day, according to the FAO, is to draw attention and inspire action to help prevent, detect, and manage foodborne risk. As we know, it's just not the health aspect of foodborne risk, but it's also how food safety contributes to food security and human health and economic prosperity and success in agriculture and market access and tourism and sustainable agriculture. So there's a lot of things that is connected to food safety. And, you know, honestly, we address them all here at K-State in one way or the other. It's really interesting. Every year they come up with kind of a theme for the event. And this particular year for 2021, the theme is Safe Food Today for a Healthy Tomorrow. And what they're trying to do is kind of take the One Health approach, holistic approach to how food safety interacts with our daily lives, whether we're producers or processors or consumers or someone transporting or whatever. We all have a role to play, and it's all systemic and integrated. You know, one weak link in the chain, start to finish, can cause a lot of people to get sick. And so I think it's really exciting that we can do some things here. And Carla has actually kind of taken on some of the leadership as far as putting some of our activities together for that day that she'll tell you about here in just a minute. But, you know, the FAO really stresses that governments, processors, consumers, and everyone in the chain has to be coordinated and focused on food safety to prevent all of these illnesses. So just think about in a world today where we have over 600 million cases of foodborne illness annually, and as many as 420,000 deaths, and about a third of those are actually children under 5 years old. So this is truly important and work that, you know, we do a lot of things here for the United States, but our work finds its way out globally, thanks to people like Dr. Vipham and Dr. Schwan, that they're going to tell you about some of their international work.
In the food security arena, we often throw around the figure that we lose 35 to 40% of the food post-harvest, pre-consumption. Are there analogous figures of loss due specifically to food safety concerns?
Well, I don't know if there's any figures about food waste or food loss, but if you look at what foodborne illness does to things other than just, people getting sick and having diarrheal diseases and that sort of thing, you look at lost productivity, you look at chronic illnesses across the world. People may be, having syndromes and sequelae well past, the initial infection. So that the cost is just staggering in terms of economic loss, adjusted years of productivity losses, and that sort of thing. So, a lot of what we don't think about from a food safety standpoint is, what does it do to young children with diarrheal diseases and setting them back for sometimes their entire life, to get past the foodborne illness, or waterborne illness falls into that category too.
When we think about losses in the industry, though, if there is a food safety concern, the industry does have to respond in different ways, some of which might be diverting a raw meat product to a cook operation, for example. And in doing so, that can result in not lost product per se, but lost income, because cook product operations usually result in a lot less income. And so there are different aspects in the food industry that can result in different losses. Sometimes the product is destroyed as a result of a food safety concern. And so that could be, quote unquote, food waste or food loss issue that is related to food safety as well.
Yeah, I think the World Trade Organization, 2017, 2019, I can't ever remember what the date is. They had a figure that they put out that was something like $9.6 billion in loss that the world experiences due to unsafe food on an annual basis.
And then I think specifically for low and middle income countries, I think the figure is like 110 billion on medical expenses and productivity losses, specifically for those countries. But I'm sure that, United States and developed countries also experience that similar levels of losses.
Yeah, so it's significant. The problem really becomes, how do you begin to measure some of the loss, right? So I think some of the points that Randy and Sarah have made, you have loss on a very individual perspective, but you also have loss on an industry level. And so how do you really get figures around that? And ultimately, when you look into the environment around economics as it pertains to food safety, that's a really new and budding area of research, surprisingly. And so I think at this point in time, we really don't have a lot of awareness for what the exact costs of food safety are. But I think based upon what we all know, we can really make the assumption that it's fairly large.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I might add to that, when we talk about food safety, a lot of us always think about pathogens, viruses, bacteria, some fungi and parasites. But, we also have a lot of toxins and chemicals and allergens that are very important and just as deadly in some cases. And particularly in some of the developing countries where we have grain and you can't just, throw the grain away, but with fungal aflatoxin and mycotoxins that are produced, some of what happens to consumption, chronic consumption of such contaminants, it could be cancers and shortened life, and you never really know that, 20, 30 years in advance.
Great, thank you so much. Carla, could you give us a bit of an idea of what K-State is planning to do for Food Safety Day and how the Food Science Institute is going to be approaching that big day?
Yes, as Dr. Phebus mentioned earlier, we've met a few weeks ago, and I think our food safety team came up with a really great idea of creating a specific video that we feature different students of our department here, and they're all from different countries of the world. For example, we have Costa Rica, we have Indonesia, Cambodia, Brazil, United States, India, Africa, all over the world pretty much. And so we have those students, we brought them in, And we wanted to just ask simple questions to understand what is their food safety perception. Some of them are food safety students, but some of them are not. And so it was interesting to see how different people from different countries and cultures perceive food safety in one way or another. So we are working on that project, and we're going to have this video ready to release on June 7th as part of the Food Science Institute initiative for the World Food Safety Day. So stay tuned for that. Additionally to that, we are featuring some of our students here to explain, and they're going to explain their projects and what they are doing in food safety, how they're improving food safety, how their projects impact public health, and the significance in advancing science in this area. And so those videos are going to be released all month of June as part of this initiative, but it's going to be individual videos of our students. And then on June 7th, we're going to have our group video of everyone talking about the World Food Safety and perceptions and all of that. So stay tuned for that.
Great. Can one of you speak a bit to the global perspective of the food safety work that's been done? You've mentioned you mentioned several countries that you've worked in, and I know Carla, you and Jessie, you two in particular have done work worldwide. How does the work at K-State impact these places around the world, and what do you learn in those places that you can bring back to K-State?
Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and take that question. When it comes to food safety, I think that one of the exciting things about food safety, and probably one of the messages that gets lost in terms of food safety education is really the breadth of opportunities that food safety provides for students, for education, right? You can be someone who's very interested in industry and find a place for yourself in food safety. You can be somebody who's very interested in economics, right, or in travel, and find spaces within food safety for yourself. And so I think that when you look at food safety, it really has a very wide swath of opportunities for itself. And when we first, I guess, started our work in international spaces, Carla and I work mainly in Africa and Southeast Asia. That's West Africa, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. I think we really began to recognize that food safety can take on a very different perspective depending upon what part of the world you're in. So, my educational background was really focused on U.S. food safety, focused on industry level intervention work, right? How do we improve really high quality systems versus, we get to Africa, we get to Southeast Asia, and you're really starting at very rudimentary spaces. And I don't mean to communicate that, that those environments don't have their own successes or their own opportunities, but you're just working in a very, very different environment, a very different mindset for food safety, and typically very different cultures. And so a lot of our work for food safety, we had to kind of, I think, tear down our education and our thoughts on food safety to really begin to look at food safety in different ways. And so as a part of that, we've done a lot of work looking specifically at fresh food markets. Those are huge across the world. So typically when we think about the United States, we have these really beautiful streamlined chains of food production, right? I have someone who produces livestock or vegetables or fruit that then goes to some form of a distribution group or processing group that then sends that through to a grocery store, and that's how we access our food. And then you get into Africa or Asia, and it's like a hairball of how things get produced and how things end up, actually sold to people. And most of the time that hairball ends up finishing at what they call fresh food markets. And so we spent a lot of time working on fresh food markets, focusing on what are some of the main points of contamination within those markets. How do we untangle those points of contamination? And then focus on interventions that are very adoptable. And so that's, I think, back to that, how do we untrain our food safety minds? You can't go into that space and just go, okay, well, just, you just got to do this, right? You just have to use lactic acid, or you just use ultraviolet light and you're good to go, right? You have to really think about what is going to be the best intervention for this space that is adoptable in an environment where people are living on very low incomes. They have very low decision-making power. The government has a very strong ability to change their mind on any given day. And so regulations aren't very clear, policies aren't very clear. How do you work within some of those constraints? And so that's a lot of, I think, what our food safety work has been, is to look at what are very applicable food safety interventions to solve the food safety issues that we have identified for specific environments within Africa and Southeast Asia.
One of the things that I've really enjoyed my time working with Jessie and Carla in their international work, but one of the things that I perceive is that people, citizens of wherever they are, they really have a desire to know proper methods, proper storage, proper disinfection, and that sort of thing. And the outreach efforts that I've seen Carla and Jessie do seem to have really good acceptance and effect. And so I think that's kind of where K-State gets thrown across the oceans, is with our outreach and educational efforts in addition to the science.
Yeah, I would say we do more outreach and sort of extension style work than even science. I guess in one sense, I think that would be, we're more extensionists than scientists. Yeah.
We have developed so much material, even for kids. I don't know if you remember Bangladesh, but just small things that you can do to prevent foodborne illness, that we just sharing that information. It seems so obvious to us, but sometimes you go to those places and just sharing that piece of information, it makes all the difference. And so I remember in Cambodia when we were doing my project in 2018, the vendors, at first, they were a little bit worried why we were trying to sample their stalls and why we were there. Then our students, our Cambodian students participating in this study, they explained everything. And once the vendors knew what we were doing, they would actually come to us and say, please come to my stall and sample here, because you need to help us save our children because they're dying from E. coli. And that was, to me, it was so impactful because I didn't even know they were aware of all of that. And they want us to help and they want to participate. They were so friendly and welcoming in those environments. And I don't know, it's such a great feeling of helping someone in this food safety area that we can impact, even though, as Jessie mentioned, sometimes the infrastructure is not as comparable to the US, but still you can make great impacts and change their environments and lives by just sharing information.
I think one of the major challenges with food safety around the world is that when you look at the population of the world, the largest population exists within countries that have compounding public health issues. And so you're not just dealing with whether or not someone's going to come into contact with raw chicken, right? You're dealing with someone who is malnourished, who might come into contact with raw chicken, who also might come into contact with a mosquito carrying malaria, who also might come into contact with water that is contaminated with, right? So you have all of these compounding public health challenges that really create an environment that's hard to work in, but I think very rewarding. And it kind of takes food safety from this space of, and I don't want to diminish the work of US food safety because it's incredibly important. But it does take it from this, hey, we're improving these really great systems to, wow, if we could unlock one of these components and find a solution, something really powerful could happen. And so that's kind of a driving force for, I think, a lot of our work in particularly Africa and Southeast Asia. I think that's a lot of why Carla and I keep going back.
True. Well, Jessie, I think I think you're also forgetting to talk about your work to help with capacity building for governments, like our project in Paraguay. And, maybe you should comment also on that and how working with the governments to improve their food safety testing is also important.
Well, I also don't want to take up too much of the talking time, but I think that is a good point and kind of speaks to, we just talked a lot about low income food safety. And I think the point that you're making, Sara, is a great one, which is that there's also a lot of middle income countries where the food safety dynamic changes. And so you're not really talking about the same scenario that you are in Africa and Southeast Asia. So if we move to places in South America, such as Paraguay, you're really looking at emerging economies, environments in which people are looking to enter into trade. And what does the dynamic of trade then do to the safety of that food supply? What are the lenses from a government perspective that need to change in terms of regulation and the capacity that government then needs to develop in order to participate in trade, not only for success of trade, but success in protection of their own, food supply, their own public health environments. And so we have participated, I think, and you could probably speak to that too, right, pretty heavily in Paraguay in terms of looking to work with labs and help with their testing capacity and work with them on whether or not they can actually, effectively carry out trade programs that still provide that stamp of approval in terms of safety of the products that are coming in and the products that they're sending out.
One thing that's been really interesting for me participating in those types of projects, and in that project particularly, is in terms of evaluating what labs, like food safety testing labs, government labs in other countries have in terms of their capacity. That's always really eye-opening as well. And learning about the challenges of Wi-Fi issues and paper-based versus electronic systems, and how to convert a paper-based system to an electronic database, for example, and the slowdowns that all of that creates in the pipeline in terms of not just receiving and testing the product, but also creating the reports and the invoices and then getting payment. And so when you evaluate the landscape, if you will, and then seek to provide solutions, it's very sort of knee-jerk, I guess, to say, well, we use this system in our government labs and it works great. And that's not necessarily applicable, right? Because no Wi-Fi or spotty Wi-Fi. And so that's another example, I think, of what you were talking about, Jessie, in terms of we have to evaluate what we're working with and then be creative also in solutions and supportive. And so that's always, I found, to be very rewarding as well and challenging from a professional growth perspective also.
One thing I always get a chuckle at is we talk about other countries, and it seems like we have this mindset that the U.S. food supply is the safest in the world. And we have to be pretty proud of our U.S. food supply, but we still have some major issues food safety wise. And when I look across the country, I know Dr. Stack does a lot of international traveling also. There are countries that probably have at least elements of their food safety system that are better than the U.S. system. Australia and New Zealand and Japan, Singapore, places like that. So, there's just such a broad diversity of food safety standards and whatnot across the globe. And trying to tackle all of them all at one time is overwhelming, but as Jessie just mentioned, I mean, you can really make a lot of headway with some basic elements in some places, whereas in other places, they're pretty sophisticated. So
I like that you bring up the fact that we like to tout ourselves as the safest food supply in the world, right? But we are always learning and improving as well. And I really appreciate, Randy, that you bring up the fact that we can learn from other countries also, and that we're all here to share and learn together. And that in turn creates a safer global food supply, which in turn improves food security and nourishes the world. So ultimately, we're all in this together, and that's what we're trying to do here at K-State. And on that note, actually, I might add a few comments regarding what K-State does in food safety. So really, as a land-grant institution, we're involved in food safety from the standpoint of teaching, research, and extension. And I mean that from a global sense, even as Jessie's demonstrated, that we're carrying out these types of activities all across the globe. But what really that includes is not just us sitting around the table. I want to emphasize that K-State has many, many experts across campus in food safety. And so we're just here to represent a small portion of experts. But, in terms of extension, we actually have consumer educators that work on food safety at the consumer level. We have extension experts working with processors, small processors, especially helping to support their HACCP plans and their testing for their facilities. And a lot of that also includes small food producers who are really trying to grow from an incubator kitchen and elevating up and become a larger processor in the Kansas or Missouri areas. So that's an important part of what we do from the extension side. And then, of course, food safety is incorporated into so many classes across campus, and not just here in the Department of Animal Science and in the Food Science Institute, but, there are elements of bakery science, for example, that they talk about food safety, and grain science in that department is a part of our food safety efforts, both teaching and research and extension. And vet med, for example, I don't want to list too many because I'm going to leave somebody out, and that's not what I'm trying to do. But I really want to really capture the essence of the collaborative effort that is food safety. And, not to leave out research, right? But we work across so many colleges and disciplines to pull off a food safety project. And I really want to refer back to something you said, Jessie, about this includes economics as well. And we work with social scientists, and it's animal scientists as well. It's pathologists. And, it really brings in, depending upon the project and the funding agency, we work with a variety of disciplines to pull off our food safety research. And I think that's a critical point to make, that it's not just us doing food safety work across campus.
I've been told, and I haven't confirmed this myself, but if you go into some of our grocery stores here and buy a processed packaged food, say a TV dinner, Dr. Stack, you and I would refer to them. I don't think they make TV dinners anymore, but a product like that might have 40 or 50 countries represented in that one package. So we are truly a global supply and food chain. And, the systems, whether they're informational systems, data systems, whatever, even hot topics like climate change and things like new emerging pathogens that we've never really seen before. We can never get lax. We can never set back and say, well, we know enough to be effective, because everything is changing so fast now. And so that's what makes food safety in particular, food science in general, and agricultural in general. But food safety it's almost every day something new happens, whether it's in this country or globally. And so that's what, having students coming from all parts of the world, like Carla coming from Brazil, it really makes our program stronger because we have that international flair at a very high level.
Over the past, say, 70 years or so, we've experienced the emergence of several zoonotic pathogens from animal hosts, reservoirs, that have had significant impacts on human health, SARS-CoV-2. And there are several suggested drivers for that emergence, including land use change, climate change, trade and travel for speeding them around. So the first part of this, I'm going to ask you to exclude. So excluding the emergence of antibiotic resistant strains, because I'd like to touch on that later, but excluding antibiotic resistance, has there been a significant emergence of new foodborne pathogens? And what were the primary drivers?
Well, that is an excellent question. Who wants to address it? I'll give you the first really beautiful, if you want to call it beautiful, example. Would have been back in 2011 when we had the emergence of never before determined STEC, Shigatoxigenic E. coli strain 0104, that happened in Europe, mainly in Germany, where we had 4,000 people just all of a sudden become ill at a really high hospitalization and death rate relative to other Shigatoxigenic E. coli infections. And come to find out, it was definitely an emerged pathogen that kind of mixed the virulence properties of more human E. coli enteric disease with what we refer to as enterohemorrhagic types of things, as far as the way the organism attached in our GI tract. And so that's a perfect example of picking up, just a floating around piece of DNA that all of a sudden turns on the switch to make something almost a super pathogen in this case. And so we tracked that one back to the type of bean sprouts that were being produced and marketed out of Egypt. And so, that you always have to be aware that these genetic virulence properties can jump from one organism to the other. And most of the time they don't have much of an effect, but all of a sudden everything can come together and you've got a really important pathogen at that point.
Yeah, I think there's lots of examples within salmonella as well, where we see salmonellas that we don't take very seriously from a public health perspective. We know that they, exist within certain animal populations, but we don't really see them show up in public health data. And then all of a sudden, you'll have a large outbreak that will occur with a certain serotype that you just really haven't seen in public health data before. And so kind of back to some points that are being made is that we have those genetic components where you ultimately what you end up with is a strain that takes on the genetic capacity to then cause human disease. I think along those lines, there is a level too where I think from a food safety perspective, we do need to recognize, and not to communicate that we don't, but that we are dealing with, from a biological hazard perspective, a lot of little living microorganisms. And they have a lot of capacity to change. And I know that Sara and I's advisor always makes the comment, turns out they don't read the book on themselves, right? And so we tend to get into a mindset of this is how salmonella behaves. This is how E. coli behaves. And all of a sudden, they don't behave that way anymore. And I think that then pushes us as food safety scientists, as individuals within the food industry, to just try to be as adaptive as possible, be as open-minded as possible, particularly when we're talking about pathogens that have shown the capacity to adapt. And in actuality, I can't really think of one that hasn't. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I'll give you a perfect example of what Jessie's talking about and relate it to climate change. We have data showing that some of the ocean waters are warming, right? And used to Vibrio parahemolyticus and Vibrio vulnificus, which are two really important public health pathogens associated with shellfish, mollusks. It was really, we didn't see it much up in our northern borders of northern coast, even here in North America. But now we're seeing kind of a migration and emergence of Vibrio problems in shellfish harvested in what was traditionally the colder waters. And it's even more complicated than that. We're seeing what we refer to in microbiology as viable but non-culturable. So you really can't detect some of these organisms until they're maybe in your body, and doing the damage, So it's all of these science facts, you can get really comfortable thinking you know enough, and then all of a sudden you don't know. It's causing 4,000 people, as the E. coli 0104 outbreak caused 4,000 people to get sick in a matter of a couple of weeks. So.
Yes, I think kind of back to close the loop on your question, I think some of the driving factors can include, some natural just variation that occurs. I think that there are some factors that come alongside changes in dynamics in terms of our production and our management practices or the environment. But I think some of it also comes from maybe some dogmatic thought processes within kind of this is the way that it is, and there's no way salmonella can be in black pepper or in dried flour. And it turns out, yeah, it can.
So we didn't mention antibiotic resistance because you asked us not to.
Yeah, that was on purpose.
Well, speaking of, I just wanted to separate them because the antibiotic resistance challenge is substantial. And, just by parallel tracks, we've learned so much about how microbes interact, and, the rate of exchange across taxa is just far greater than we ever anticipated, than we would have predicted probably 15 years ago. And so, the obvious concern for antibiotic resistance is the ineffectiveness of subsequent treatment for infection. But I guess to tie it to the previous question, the question I wanted to pose is, for foodborne pathogens, what are the inherent risks of transmitting that resistance to other intestinal bacteria during the course of the infection and subsequent clearing? So I'm looking at it as, not only are we concerned about resistance in the foodborne pathogen, but are the foodborne pathogens becoming a vector for moving those resistance cassettes, the genomic islands, around, just as a course of how we do business?
So I might comment on that a little bit from the perspective of Shiga toxin producing E. coli, actually. So we actually don't recommend antibiotics as a course of action, because a lot of times what can happen is that Shiga toxins being produced in the cell, and the antibiotics then might lyse the cell and release it. And then suddenly you have a mass release of the Shiga toxin that can kind of overwhelm the body all at once and create many complications from a clinical perspective for the patient. So you might ask the question then, well, why should we care about antibiotic resistance genes or characteristics in something like STEC? And it's really from a perspective of what you're mentioning, Dr. Stack, in terms of then if we do have STEC in cattle or in the environment or in our guts, for example, that there are other microorganisms around, other bacteria that can then share those genes. So even if a antibiotic resistant STEC might not get treated in a human with an antibiotic because of the concerns I mentioned, there are concerns though that it will be sharing its genetic makeup and sharing those genes to others. And so now we might have something that was a susceptible bacteria that is now harboring antibiotic resistance genes. And of course, the risk there depends upon what is being shared with. And then of course, how broadly does that then share its genes? So you can see there's kind of a domino effect, but when you think about animals and their GI tracts and their environments and our GI tracts, right? They're a separate sort of ecosystem with a variety of different bacteria and other microorganisms hanging out. And that can impact the sharing of genes, and that is a concern.
One of the big issues that has emerged over the last decade in antibiotic resistance is Clostridium difficile. And my father was just in the hospital. He passed, but I was actually talking to some of the doctors there at fighting Clostridium difficile antibiotic resistance in a hospital environment, whether that's in the cafeteria where your general population is consuming food, or the food being brought to infirmed patients. And now it's expanding to cafeterias and schools and places like that. And a lot of the isolates are antibiotic resistant, and that makes it even more difficult to address.
Yeah, from the research we have conducted, and commenting back on Dr. Gragg's point, we've seen that because we did some whole genome sequencing with the isolates from the research, and we've seen that some of the isolates collected from the year before, some didn't have antibiotic resistance, and then next year they already presented that antibiotic resistance. And really looking at the whole genome sequencing and comparing those strains, they were the same, considered the same strain, but acquired some of those genes they didn't have before. And really this complex environment that you have many different species playing around, and they just interact so much that it's so easy to see then, something that didn't have now all of a sudden it has this resistance.
And you're referring to your work in Southeast
Yes,
Asia, right?
yes, to specifically my work in Southeast Asia.
And well, I think I would just follow up on a lot of the conversation with, that this in the whole area of antimicrobial resistance and research in antimicrobial resistance is an incredibly complex area, right? There's so much to consider. And I think the more we know, the less we know. And that's just what's being made clear, right? Is that as we begin to unravel some of the components around AMR and antibiotic resistance, it really is becoming clear how well are you measuring it? How well do you know, phenotypic versus genotypic? Can you trace back to, source? All of those things become incredibly complex, right? And you almost you can really get into a very circular space where one set of isolates collected from one environment could be a lifetime's worth of evaluation to try to identify what exactly is going on there, and are you measuring that as accurately as possible. And I think a point that I just wanted to make is, when we started doing Carla's research and looking at that whole genome sequencing of the isolates that we collected from fresh markets, I think it became very clear to us early on that there's so much out there in terms of taking that data, evaluating that data, and then reevaluating that data, because there's just and you could probably speak to it better than I could. There's a lot in terms of understanding these genes, what they mean, how they interact together, what the names are, what the there's various names for the different antibiotic resistance genes. Trying to ensure that you see that from a phenotypic perspective.
And not only just the genes, sometimes we focus on the genes that could confer a resistance to specific antibiotics, but then it has the gene, but somehow it's not expressing resistance, or it doesn't have the gene, but is expressing resistance. And then you dig a little bit deeper, and you find it has some pumps that were not present before, that people didn't know about, and now maybe that efflux pump is helping in this specific antibiotic that we were not aware before. And so it's very interesting to look over time at the database that NCBI provides and just see that, last year we saw 5 different genes that could encode resistance. And then this year we have additional 2 efflux pumps that were not there before and are helping to explain why we might see that, or why we might not see that resistance in those isolates. So it's really interesting how it just changes as more that we gather information, less we know, probably, as Jessie mentioned. And yeah.
And today, the way we trade food and agricultural products, whatever that gene is down in Brazil, could be in America in 2 days, right?
Yeah.
So,
Then they will adapt.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that, again, not to just kind of continue with the same comment, but they are going to, from a bacterial perspective, right? We have to recognize from a food safety mindset that they're going to adapt. And so we're always working with I don't want to call them a foe. That seems harsh, but we're working on prevention of a group of organisms, microorganisms, that are going to adapt to whatever we're doing. And that's got to be part of that thought process.
Yeah, I had to follow up on that. In the plant world, we have, of course, a group of enteric bacteria that infect plants outright, and we're finding what we would have considered a species in the past. They're so variable that they're exchanging on genomic islands. They're not just exchanging resistance genes or genes for adaptation. They're exchanging whole secretion systems, so that we can have certain populations with 1 or 2 secretion systems and another one with half a dozen. So those are the tools that those bacteria need to adapt and maybe even adapt to a new host species. To kind of bring us back to World Food Safety Day. What do you consider are the pressing gaps in our knowledge, and what are the opportunities for reducing the impacts from foodborne illness? Where do we need to head? What's our vision?
I think that a huge one is understanding the role of foodborne disease on nutrition gains. And again, that comes back to when you look at the population of the world and the percentage of that population that lives in environments where nutrition is a major concern. And I mean, I think that could be applied to high income countries as well, but my focus is really low income countries. And so I guess I'll speak to it from that space. Having an understanding for the dynamics between foodborne disease and negated nutrition gains would, I think, change the discussion around investment in sanitary and hygienic infrastructure around the world, which ultimately at the end of the day, I think it's alarming that has not been a bigger conversation, that we have such large populations of the world that are living in incredibly unhygienic, unsanitary environments. And so I think until you are able to say the reason why Africa is not seeing gains in their nutrition outcomes, or the reason why Asia is not seeing gains in their nutrition outcomes, has a lot to do with diarrheal disease, which is a hypothesis that most people working within food safety in international spaces have. I don't know that you're going to see a huge investment in that space. And so I think having data that really can explicitly show that would be huge.
And I'll also add to your question, Jim, especially if you bring it back more toward home and developed countries, is we are in an era where we're really going toward minimal processing of foods, what we lovingly refer to as clean labels, doing away with preservatives and, really going toward fresh and local and that sort of thing. And to me, some of this technology is opening the doors to new issues in food safety. I don't want to just come out and say that those types of products are less safe, but they have to be managed differently. If we're not putting preservatives and things in foods, then obviously you can have more microbial growth. And so I think it's an era that, especially me, I'm really into interventions and things like that, research as far as food safety. it's something that's a very pressing and real issue today. And I think it is, as we look into the next 5 years, I don't see it changing. I think we're really going toward that more natural, clean label, green produced type food system. And we have to address it. And I think if you look at FDA, for instance, they have just come out with a document that's kind of giving their vision for the new era of food safety, is what they call it. And a lot of it is global supply chains, minimal processing, and emergence of new pathogens, things like what we've talked about today on this podcast.
And I might add too that, and this is, I'm a little biased because I'm a primarily salmonella researcher, but I feel like the salmonella problem is going to continue on our radar for the foreseeable future. You know, we've made tremendous progress on Shiga toxin producing E. coli. You know, particularly we focus a lot on the beef industry, and we've made tremendous progress there. What we haven't made progress on, and you might argue we've made some progress, but is reducing salmonella in terms of public health, and as well as in different food commodities, including beef, for example. And we're making a lot of progress and starting to understand why that might be, and particularly in different food products. How is it in a cow, for example, and therefore why is it a risk? So we're starting to make progress, but in terms of like the healthy people guidelines for the government, we aren't making progress there if you look at it from that perspective. And so I feel like food safety is going to continue to really be emphasizing funding to figure out what the salmonella issue is, why it's a problem, and then what do we do about it. And that's in a variety of products, right? Jessie, you mentioned flour, right? And we've mentioned beef. It's been in produce, just to name a few of the many. So salmonella will definitely continue to be on the radar for a while.
Yeah,
Salmonella is actually a bona fide plant pathogen based on all the genetic work done in the last few years. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I did not know that.
I was just going to close the loop here and talk about, I think, part of the extension and outreach, you know, the consumer side. How do we educate consumers to then make sure that, you know, if we are all diligent and make our part and everybody's doing their part all across the chain, and then when it reaches consumer and they don't know what to do and how to handle their food safely, that could be very detrimental to, you know, preventing foodborne illness. And I think just looking at the calls of action that the World Food Safety Day calls for, one of them is team up for food safety. And I think we really could use that to team up for food safety and educate people around us, our friends, our families. And I find sometimes hard to just communicate. And I think I have spoken enough times to my friends not to eat a underdone burger, that now when they are eating with me, they look at me and they say, okay, yeah, well done, please. And they ask the server to be well done. And I guess you just have to do it over and over and over again until, you know, we're to a point where people just have that in their minds and they know some of the practices they can choose, some of the choices can be safer than what they used to do. And I think just it's as much as important as everything else, just the consumer awareness, and they know what to do, what they can do to protect themselves and their families.
I just want to take a minute and actually underline that, because as we were going around, I thought, if no one says it, I'm gonna be selfish and take a second stab, because I think that I mean, as much as that sounds a little crazy, and I don't know, I might get kicked out of every food safety group I exist in, but we need a grassroots movement back to consumer education. We really do, because we've moved away from it. And there is a true lack of, I think, understanding of just really basic food safety, in-home food safety information in upcoming generations of people. My mom always kind of takes the stance that it's because of home economics. And I think she's got maybe a point, but her point is grounded in that it's due to a lack of food safety education for consumers. And so whether that's home economics not being in high school anymore or not, right, it means that there isn't something that is providing particularly young people with some level of information on this is how you safely prepare food within your home.
Yeah.
And we have to have a grassroots movement back to it because we've kind of forgotten it.
One of the scariest things as a food microbiologist myself is walking around the tailgates at football games and watching what goes on at tailgates relative to food safety. It's amazing that we don't have huge outbreaks every weekend, in these types of environments.
Unfortunately for us, people don't want to invite us over for
We don't
meals
have
very
friends.
often.
Let's be honest, we don't have friends.
A
Food
lot of-
safety scientists.
A lot of my friends actually say that they're intimidated for me to even be near them when they're even 5 feet within the kitchen. So,
But when
It's-
you're traveling internationally, they all want to be sitting right next to you.
Me too. That's so
Yeah.
true.
They're like, if Jesse doesn't eat it, I'm not gonna eat it.
That's so true. But I really like how you all really close the loop with that conversation because it's something we talk about amongst ourselves a lot, but really struggle with. And another thing, kind of going back to one of my comments earlier about how it takes all disciplines in food safety is
Yes.
one of the things that we also really need is working with our social science friends and colleagues to understand how to get the message out in a way that it will be received and valued. And because that's another piece, right? Is
Yeah.
I could put together all the data I wanted on salmonella in cattle, but how do I make somebody care about it? How do I deliver that message in a way that's meaningful for my mom in her kitchen, right? And how it translates from what we do here to the burger that she needs to cook well done. So it really takes a whole team to address that question as well. But I really like, though, how we started out talking about processors, consumers, researchers, everybody, and now you closed it with the consumers as well. It's a really good point.
And I guess that comment and some of the comments that have been made throughout the discussion brings back the importance of the Food Science Institute at K-State, which is truly an interdisciplinary group. And you've got scientists and researchers from all aspects of research in that area, and very important approach to getting things done the right way.
The Food Science Institute is very focused on food safety and along with general food science. And I would just like to remind everybody that as June 7th comes up and the week before and probably the week or two after at our Food Science website, Food Science Institute website, we will have the video posted that Carla mentioned. We'll be sending that to the Food and Ag organization. Hopefully it'll see some international use, and we'll continue to put out as much information as we can about our food safety program and just general guidance for consumers and processors.
That sounds wonderful, and we will definitely get some connections to those sites through our Global Food Systems website as well, so that we can get the information out and share all the great things that you're doing and the students are doing. I think this is an exciting time.
If you're really interested in this topic, you can find a lot of things going on. Hashtag World Food Safety Day. Got to get that hashtag in there.
I really enjoyed the discussion, so thank you so much for your time today. There's a difference between observing human behavior and understanding it. And that's our challenge, because I agree with the comments about the need for re-engaging the public in food safety, because it seems like we're in this era of, undercooked is better. And if you watch the Food Network shows, it's almost sinful to cook things all the way through. I think your challenge is big, so good luck.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to that point, right, it may be one of the best ways to kind of close this down is that the World Food Safety Day, their big theme and has been, across the different years has been food safety is everybody's business. And so, I think that's something that we very much believe here at K-State, that food safety is everybody's business. and that we're really attempting to cultivate an environment in which we take that into our classrooms, we take that into our research, and we take that into our extension. And so engaging with the consumer is a huge part of that, and making sure that they are a part of that everybody's business is a really important one.
Well, great. This has been a good experiment, having a group of people discussing on an important topic like food safety, and we're really excited to be able to put this out in time for International Food Safety Day. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you
Thank you very much.
Opportunity.
Thank you all.
Thanks
John.
so much. Have a great day.
If you have any questions or comments you would like to share, check out our website at ksu.edu/research/global food and drop us an email. Our music was adapted from Wayne Gowen's album, Chronicles of Carmela. Special thanks to him for providing that to us. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.